Hello everybody, this is Dr. Christopher White, and today we'll be looking at exercise number 9 from Interpreting Earth History by Ritter and Peterson. Okay, so you'll find exercise number 9 on page 138. So just like all the other exercises in this book, there's a set of stated learning objectives, and there's a paragraph briefly discussing evolution at the bottom of page 138. It's extremely short, so once again, take a minute, read it, it's not going to hurt. So we're going to start with part A, and part A is focused on the information provided on page 139. So on page 139 we have figure 9.1 and figure 9.2. Now figure 9.1 displays the suture lines which are shown by animals in the class Ammonoidea. So ammonoids are essentially a group of organisms that first appear in the Devonian, and they make it all the way through to the end of the Cretaceous, and then unfortunately they meet their ends just like the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous due to the KT mass extinction. So the thing about the class Ammonoidea is that they display things called suture marks on their shells. So if you remember, I'm sure you've seen it already, but an ammonoid, of which the most famous group is the group ammonites, they are essentially, think of them like octopi that live inside spiral shells. Okay, so these shells have things called suture lines on them, also called suture marks. So one of the things about these suture lines is that over time they steadily became more and more complex. So we can see here we have 6 different diagrams of suture lines from A to F, and you can see quite clearly that they are becoming more and more complex as we go from one example to another. So very early animals in the subclass Ammonoidea would have very simple suture lines like A. Now over time, as the subclass progressed, the suture lines became more and more complicated. So later members of the subclass Ammonoidea would have very complex suture lines like F. And so the suture lines of animals like ammonites are actually quite helpful to us, because they give us a very crude way, to date essentially the material we're looking at. If we find animals, if we find ammonoids within our sediment that have very simple suture lines like this here, well, in that instance we can go, do you know what? This is probably a relatively early sediment. We're probably looking at something that could be, Devonian or Carboniferous in age. On the other hand, if we find our ammonites, for instance, in a sediment and they have very complex suture lines, well, we'd say, okay, this is probably more likely to be something like Jurassic or Cretaceous in age. So what we have here in the top right is figure 9.2. So figure 9.2 obviously displays 6 diagrams of suture lines. And so what you're going to do, it's a relatively simple task, is you are going to try and put these 6 suture lines in the correct order using figure 9.1 as a guide. And so these are the ammonoid species from which these suture lines are taken, and so you're going to try and put these 6 ammonoid species into the correct order from oldest to youngest, and that's it. So it does say compare the order given by our instructor, but I've got to be honest, people normally get 6 out of 6 on this particular question, so I don't really think there's much need for me to show you what I produce, because there's a very good probability you're going to get it spot on. Okay, so what's next? Well, on page 140 we have part B. So part B consists of 3 questions. So the first part focuses on the human skeleton, which is figure 9.4, which you'll find on page 141. And it also uses the skeleton at the page 140, which is this skeleton here, which is a skeleton of an animal called Dimetrodon. So Dimetrodon is an animal that lived in the late Paleozoic, so you would have found this particular animal strolling around the Earth probably during the Permian. Okay, it's a part of a group of animals called the fin-backed reptiles, and you can actually see, the fin on the back there. Okay, So what are we, what's the plan here? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the various bones which are identified on the skeleton on page 9.4. So you can see on this diagram here, several bones have been selected. Okay, so coming all the way here from the cervical vertebrae at the top, all the way down to the phalanges at the bottom here. Okay, so your mission is to find these bones on this skeleton, and to be very, very clear, you will label the bones on this diagram. So when you identify a bone, you will draw a line to it and you will write what that bone is. Okay, don't get confused. Don't write a list of the bones that you see here, okay, up here. It happens every once in a while, and when you do that, I can't give you any marks because all you've done there is written a list of bones. Okay, so I need you to annotate this diagram telling me where the bones are. Okay, so you will find all of these bones on this skeleton. I should also point out that phalanges turns up twice, so you will be writing it on the diagram twice. I don't want you to write it just once, it should turn up twice. Okay, I will also point out, if I just put the diagram here, I'm actually just going to zoom in on this and hopefully I can maintain focus. So, sorry about this guys, just give me 1 second. Okay, you can hear my kids fighting with the dogs downstairs, for which I apologise. Just give me 1 minute just to get a bit of focus going on this thing. I have far too many things open on my desktop right now. Okay, so here's diagram 9.3, figure 9.3. We've zoomed in on it a little bit. So I just want to point out that, if I can find my pencil, there it is, that you can obviously see we have the spinal column here, we have the ribs here, that's pretty easy to spot. So this shape here, okay, now this is going to be the pelvis, and this thing right here, okay, this almost diamond shaped thing right here, that is going to be the femur, the upper leg bone. Okay, so on a human being, the femur is here. Okay, it joins the pelvis. Essentially, it's the bone that connects the pelvis to the lower leg bones. Okay, so right here, I'm just telling you this just to make your life easier. This is going to be the femur. Okay, so you're thinking to yourself, well, why does that look the way it does? Well, it's because Dimetrodon would have had a gait somewhat similar to a crocodile. And as I'm sure you know, crocodiles, the legs pretty much stick straight out sideways, don't they? So what you're doing here is you're looking at the femur, but you're looking at the femur bone end on. So that's why it has this rather interesting shape to it. So just to help you, this is going to be the femur right here. Okay? So that's just giving you a little bit of assistance there. Alright, but I'm just going to zoom out now and hope that I can get things back the way they were. I do apologise, just please give me 1 moment. Oh dear, I'm going to ruin things. Never should have fiddled around with it. Mistake on my part. Oh, it's all going on outside my house right now. Okay. Alright, so just let me try and sort out my mess. There we go. And if you just give me 1 moment just to refocus. See if I can make things look better. Okay, that's going to have to do. Okay, so that's part 1. So please, please, please remember, I need the bones annotated on the diagram. Do not muck that up, please. Come on, I've told you enough times. Don't give me a list right here. I need them on the diagram. Okay, so you will draw a line to the bone and you will then write what the bone is. So you'll draw a line to this and you will write femur. Okay, I just want to make sure everyone gets full marks for that. Okay, So next we have question number 2. So question number 2 asks you to colour in the homologous bones in the front limbs of the mammals, reptiles and birds illustrated in figure 9.5. So if we come to 9.5, which is going to be on page 142, you will see we have a selection of forelimbs. In fact, we have 8 of them. Okay, and these forelimbs come from a range of different animals. So A is from a seal, B is from a pterodactyl, so a flying reptile, C is from a modern bat, D is from a modern bird, E is from a saber-toothed cat, F is from a mammal-like reptile from the Permian, G is from a early horse, and H is from a Jurassic plesiosaur, a marine reptile. And so the challenge is to try and find the same bones in all of these forelimbs. So the question is what bones are we looking for? Okay, well, let's go back to page 140 and let's work our way through the list. Okay, so the first bone we're looking for is the scapula. Okay, the scapula is known as the shoulder blade. Okay, so I'm sure you know we have the humerus, which is the upper arm bone, and our humerus will connect into our scapula. And so what you can quite clearly see here is, well, for instance, I'm just going to point it out to you in this instance, this is going to be the scapula right here. Okay, so that's going to be the scapula right there. All right. Now this means that as this is the scapula, this therefore is going to be the humerus, so the upper arm bone. Alright, so you would be colouring the humerus in red. Now the next 2 bones you're looking for are the radius and the ulna. So just to give you some idea, by the way, I'm just going to come over here to page 141. And you're going to see the radius and the ulna are the lower arm bones. Okay, and so if we look at picture A, we can quite clearly see we have the radius and the ulna right there. Not that difficult to spot. Alright, so what's next? So next we want to find the metacarpals and finally the phalanges. So the metacarpals are essentially the lower bones in your finger here that join to the palm bones, your carpals. Okay, the carpals are kind of your wrist going into your palm. Then you have the metacarpals, which is kind of your palm going into your fingers, and your fingers themselves are the phalanges. And so what we're going to do is we're going to identify the metacarpals. So the metacarpals are obviously going to be these bones here. And then finally we have the phalanges, the digits, which we can see right there. So the aim is for you to colour them in. Now if you have a hard copy of the book like this, you can grab your coloured pencils and you can colour away to your heart's content. That's relatively easily done. If, however, you are working with the online version of this textbook, what's the best way of doing this? Well, once again, the most simple way is to take a screen grab, put it into a program, Word, maybe PowerPoint, depending on what you prefer using, and simply label the bones. So S for scapula, H for humerus, R for radius, U for ulna, M for metacarpals, P for phalanges. Okay, and just put letter labels on the bones, just so I know where they are, because obviously colouring them in on a computer, unless you have the the correct hardware, is going to be rather tricky. Okay, now don't be scared with these more complex forelimbs up here. Okay, just be consistent. Number 1, identify the scapula. Number 2, once you've found the scapula, well then clearly the next bone is going to be the humerus. Once you've identified the humerus, then the next bone is quite clearly going to be, bones should I say, are going to be the radius and the ulna. Then after the radius and the ulna must come the metacarpals. Then after the metacarpals must come the phalanges. So you should be able to work out your bones relatively easily. Just start with the scapula and work your way from there. Okay? So you should be able to do this with all 8. I am just going to make a quick point down here about the plesiosaur forelimb. This bit of bone up here, that's your scapula right there. Alright? So, just going to point that out there. Now the radius and the ulna are a little bit difficult to identify here, but they are there. So you're going to have to work out which ones they are. Okay, so that is part 2. All relatively straightforward. Now finally, part 3, we need to summarise the modifications that are evident in the various limbs and explain, if possible, the reasons for nature's selection of the modifications in view of the environment where the various organisms lived. So let's go back to our forelimbs here, okay? Well, let's try and split our forelimbs up into groups. So here we have a pterodactyl, so a flying reptile, we have a bat, and we have a bird. So B, C and D, these are airborne animals. Okay, in the case of A and H, what we have are marine animals. And in the case of E, F and G, we have animals that lived on land. So let's just see if we can spot some similarities between these limbs. Well, if we have a look at these limbs here, well, what are the kind of things that we can see? Well, if you remember, if you're an animal that flies, the main challenge is to make sure you keep your weight low. It makes it easier for you to fly. So, for instance, if you're a flying animal, obviously the first thing you do is you have hollow bones. Now, obviously you can't see that on this diagram, so you wouldn't write that. Okay, but just look at these bones. Look at what's happened to them. Compare the thickness of these bones to something like the seal limb here. Okay, so also compare the number of bones. For instance, look at this bird forelimb here. Okay, notice how, well, it looks rather simplified, doesn't it, compared to the other limbs? Have bones been lost, maybe? Have bones been made smaller, so you can't see them? Just think about that kind of thing. Look and see what adaptations have been made to these forelimbs here that make them more efficient when it comes to flying. Okay. Also, by the way, take a look at these digits here. Okay, on B and C. So pterodactyls and bats don't have the same kind of wing as a bird. In the case of pterodactyls and bats, B and C, they have a wing formed essentially of a membrane of skin which is pulled tight. So they have to have bone struts to support that membrane. So, you might want to think about mentioning that. Well, now let's think about A and H. Okay, well, these are marine organisms. So what do we know about marine organisms? Well, the first thing we know about moving through water is that it's tough. It takes a lot more energy to move through water than it does to move through the air. So if you're going to have to move through water and you're going to do it effectively, what do you need? You are going to need some serious muscles. And if you have serious muscles, well, let's think about it. Can you put a big, powerful muscle on thin, weedy bones like this? What's going to happen to them? As soon as you use that muscle, that bone is going to... So in that case, how do you design your bones? What do you do? The next thing is, let's have a look at the phalanges here. Okay. So when you think about the animals that move through the seas, animals like seals and other animals like that, well, they tend to have quite large paddle-like forelimbs, don't they? Okay, that helps to steer them through the water, and they can also use them for propulsion where required. So, the word that's sometimes used is oar-like. So, have a look at these limbs here. Try and work out what adaptations have been made to make them more efficient in the water. So, finally, we're on to E, F, and G. So these are animals that are living on land. Now, let's try and think about them. Well, we have some differences though, don't we? E is a saber-toothed cat, so that's a predator. Whereas G is a very early horse, so that's essentially a herbivore. It's going to want to get away from E. So let's have a think about, for instance, how the leg of G is designed. Well, think about a horse. A horse is all about having super long legs, which are relatively thin to save on weight. So look at the limb here. What can you see about it? Okay. So try and describe, look at it and try and see the adaptations that have been made to make this limb more efficient for a horse-like animal. In contrast, have a look at this limb here. Okay. See how it's designed. So when you look at this limb here, there's actually not much special about this limb, scapula, etc., etc. There's not much interesting about it. It's when you come down to the hand, that's where it starts to look more interesting, doesn't it? The rest of it's all pretty, normal. But look at how this hand is designed. So look at the kind of the shape of the phalanges versus these other organisms. How are the phalanges arranged? And then think about how this particular type of animal would like to move. Remember, it's a cat. So think about the way that cats like to move, especially if they're going after prey. And that's going to maybe to some degree explain why the phalanges have the arrangement they do. Now, in the case of F, on the other hand, let's just think about it this way. So this is a very early reptile mammal hybrid. Essentially, it's one of these intermediate forms between mammals and reptiles. So the first thing is well, do we expect this forelimb to be very specialized? Okay. Remember, it's one of the first, very earliest steps of the transition. So would we expect this particular limb to be specialized for any particular use? Well, the answer is no. So does it look that specialized? Well, no, it doesn't. But when it comes to this limb, the thing I want you to take notice of is the position of the upper arm bone relative to the shoulder blade. Okay? Take a look at that and kind of notice, the difference versus some of the other limbs here. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to spend a few minutes and you're going to write me a paragraph, and you're going to, if you can, fit it in here. If not, don't be scared to go on Word and write a little Word document about it. Okay. Now, the one thing I would ask is try not to make it too dense. If you can do it in something like bullet points, that would be wonderful. It just makes it easier for me to read and easier for me to mark. Okay. So, oh, there's my dog again, guarding the house from dangerous things like squirrels and clouds. So if you can write the paragraph in here, or once again on a separate piece of paper, that's fine. Try and keep it simple. Okay, so I hope I've given you kind of some basic ideas about what you might want to consider writing for these forelimbs. Okay, so that's it for exercise number 9. It's a nice, super simple exercise, and that's your lot. So, okay, enjoy this one. A lot of people do. So, take care. Have fun.